I think now's the time. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the April seminar for the Western Center for Agricultural Health and Safety. We really appreciate you all joining us today. My name is Heather Ryden. I'm the program director, and I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items before handing the floor over to our speaker. This seminar is being recorded and it will be posted on YouTube in the next few days. All participants are muted. During the presentation, if you have any questions or technical issues, please put them in the chat. And we will collect those questions for a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Spanish interpretation is available for this presentation. If you select the interpretation option at the bottom of your Zoom screen, it says interpretation and it looks a little bit like a globe. You will be able to hear the presentation in Spanish. And I'll pause now just for a moment to allow Reina a moment to translate these housekeeping items and turn on interpretation.
La comunidad estas notas.
Okay, thank you so much.
Bueno, gracias a todos. La interpretación está aprendida. Gracias. Muy complacida de introducir a Kimberly Prado. Ella es la estudiante de PhD.
And has been working with the Western Center for Ag Health and Safety for several years now. She's going to be talking about her research evaluating workplace sexual harassment among farm workers. So welcome, Kimberly, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. I hope we're able to see that. Sorry, let's see.
We saw it and then we lost it. If you want to try one more time.
All right, I'm going to open this up. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I appreciate your attention and your time, your interest. Well, my name is Kimberly. I am a fourth-year PhD student in the graduate group of Epidemiology at University of California, Davis. And today I'll be sharing my work with you that has spanned over the course of the last 4 years. The topic today is workplace sexual harassment among men and women farm workers. And this is a binational study. So I partnered with researchers at University of Michoacán de San Nicolás de Hidalgo. And my project was funded by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, PIMSA, UC's Berkeley's investigation program on migration and health, and the Western Center for Ag Health and Safety. I also had a number of partners help along the way on the study approach, the study strategy, the study's instrument developments, and dissemination. And now we're in our 4th year, so we have a couple new findings, and we're going to work closely with our partners on that. A little bit about me. I am the daughter of 2 great immigrants from El Salvador who came to the United States in the 80s seeking asylum from the Civil War. And both of my parents, they're hardworking individuals. They taught me a lot about service and leadership. And so as an undergrad, I studied clinical nutrition and exercise biology. After that, I went into the community as a promotora, or a community health educator, bilingual educator among Spanish-speaking, low-income, rural, migrant, and seasonal farm worker families. After that, I got my master's in public health, and I looked at food insecurity, food literacy, and nutrition among low-income Spanish, rural-speaking, seasonal migrant farm workers. And now in my PhD, I'm entering the realm of occupational health and safety, and it allows me to merge my love for research, for service, and leadership, and stay connected to my community. So I'm really happy that I have this opportunity to share this work with you. A little word of caution on this presentation is that we cover sensitive information. So if at any point you need to take a break, if at any point you need to pause, please feel free to do so. and the presentation recording will be available for your convenience when you're ready to get back to see the rest of the presentation. Now, a little background. Different organizations have shed light on this topic. For example, nonprofit organizations like Human Rights Watch and the Southern Poverty Law Center have documented testimonios, the circumstances in which this type of violence against women occurs, and the stories of victims in reports such as Cultivating Fear and Injustice on Our Plates. And there's also been some media shedding light on the topic, such as the documentary called Rape in the Fields by PBS and Frontline. Court cases have also shed light on the topic, though victims rarely end up reporting their cases because of fear of retaliation and fear of violence, and most of their cases are dismissed. So other areas that shed light on this topic are organizations that represent farm workers, like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida, where they've created this space for farm workers to organize and protest these injustices. You may have also heard of the Me Too movement, mostly pushed forward by women in the entertainment industry, actresses and singers. But this has also crossed borders into Mexico. And the Times recently published an article written by Alianza Nacional de Campesinas, the National Alliance of Farm Worker Women, saying that them and their members, the 700,000 female farm workers across the United States, stand with these actresses and entertainers against sexual violence against women. And if you look at the cover, you'll see on the corner this arm of a woman sitting on the side, and her face and her body's not shown. And this arm it represents all of those other women in those other sectors of employment that don't have a platform for their voices to be heard, such as farm worker women. Other projects have shed light on the topic as well, like the Bandana Project, raising awareness about sexual harassment violence, workplace sexual violence among farm workers, and the curriculum created by my partners at University of Washington, titled BASTA, Prevent Sexual Harassment in Agriculture. This is a curriculum for employees and employers in agriculture to prevent sexual harassment. So what is it? In the United States, we have a definition from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they say that it is unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. It is against the law in the United States, all 50 states, under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And federal court has identified two kinds of workplace sexual harassment: quid pro quo and hostile work environment. In Mexico, workplace sexual harassment is acknowledged in the Federal Penal Code. It is against the law in 16 of 32 Mexico states, and they have the general law for women to have access to a life free of violence. And in this law, they define sexual harassment as an exercise of power in relation to the subordination of the victim by the aggressor in a labor or school environment. It's expressed as verbal and or physical sexual conduct with an intense sexual desire. And it is a kind of violence. It's an exercise of abuse of power. It renders the victim helpless and at high risk of regardless if it's one or more events. Now, researchers take a closer look at the definition. And so researchers say that any unwanted sex-related behavior that is appraised by the recipient as offensive or threatening is workplace sexual harassment. And when we look at the kinds of harassment, there's three general types: gender harassment, unwanted sexual attention, and sexual coercion. But across the board, researchers have documented that workplace sexual harassment is a prominent and detrimental barrier to a person's career development and satisfaction. Upon our initial search, we found that key terms, workplace sexual harassment, in ProQuest PsycInfo, for example, only yielded few results in recent years. So over the past decades, we've only seen a few hundred works published, and even less when we enter the terms farm worker. So for example, on one of these searches, we only found one paper show up for workplace sexual harassment among farm workers. This one took place among indigenous farm workers in Oregon. And so if we look at the prevalence of workplace sexual harassment, we can see that your exposure really is based on your position in society. So for example, if we look at half of all women in the United States, they're reporting workplace sexual harassment, as well with half of all working women in the United States. And same with half of women faculty and students in universities across the United States. Now, if we look at women in the Army, they report 6 out of 10 times, 10 women, they're exposed to sexual harassment, and 6 out of 10 working class Latinas are exposed to sexual harassment. Now, farm worker women have higher rates of exposure. And so, for example, we see here that in one survey among women farm workers in the Central Valley, it was reported that 8 out of 10 women were experiencing sexual harassment. And leaders in the field have called this an epidemic. For example, Dolores Huerta, a labor leader, civil rights activist, and co-founder of the United Farmworkers of America, has been recorded saying that the women wear these bandanas. As you know, it's kind of a protection in many ways from trying to keep the foreman from looking at them. It's kind of a way of hiding yourself. So she says, this has been one of those hazards of the job because of the way that farm worker women are treated. They are looked at as sex objects when they are out there in the field. Now, other leaders in the field, in this area, among farm worker activism, the founders of Alianza Nacional de Campesinas, founded by attorney Mónica Ramirez and activist Billy Treviño Sauceda, say that there are 700,000 women farm worker members across the United States are particularly concerned with ending workplace exploitation and including sexual harassment. So Millie was recorded saying that her experiences in the field led her into this career as a union organizer. And she is fighting for the health, safety, and security of all field laborers. Because one of the things that they constantly faced was sexual assault, harassment, and violence in the workplace, as well as domestic violence in the home. Monica has been recorded saying that in every single case that she's handled, the cases she's represented, the women who speak up, they've all come forward saying, I'm not taking action for myself, I'm taking action because I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Now, if we look at the evidence that we have thus far on workplace sexual harassment among women farm workers, we can see that in the late 90s, the EEOC documented that thousands of women farm workers had to have sex with supervisors for work. They faced constant grabbing, touching, and prepositions for sex by supervisors. Later in the decades, we can see that cases in Washington recorded women's bodies being gazed at, being offered work for sex. Cases in Oregon documented women farm workers being groped by supervisors. Cases in California documented women farm workers being exposed to degrading and sexist language, being touched, being blackmailed. Cases in Baja California, Sonora, and Sinaloa in Mexico documented sexual stares and sexual demands from all levels of the ag hierarchy, like transporters, co-workers, supervisors, and crew leaders. And in Tamaulipas, cases included frequent sexual violence. And now there are consequences to workplace sexual harassment. They extend beyond the victim, but we can see that for the victim, there are psychological consequences such as suicidal ideation and depression, physiological consequences like emotional exhaustion and headaches, physical consequences like unwanted pregnancy and rape injuries. This extends into the crew because they can be bystanders or they can also be direct victims. This can result in lower productivity from the crew, increased absenteeism from the crew. And for the organization, they can face consequences like legal fees, increased sick leave costs, and negative publicity. And if we look at this problem, we can see that it is a ubiquitous phenomenon cutting across age, race, marital status, and occupational distinctions. We know sexual harassment has been associated with negative psychological, health, and work academic outcomes. And women of color are multiply marginalized due to race, gender, and class, which places them at increased risk of victimization. And farm workers, sub-minimum wage restaurant workers, single mothers, and janitorial workers are all several groups that are not highlighted and remain largely unseen in the current Me Too era. And so this isn't the only hazard that women farm workers face. Both women and men farm workers face safety hazards, environmental, biological, and respiratory dangers. So on top of workplace sexual harassment, what can compound that is exposure to other kinds of injuries. Farm workers, it's been documented, farm workers face physical injuries on a daily basis, and they work through these musculoskeletal discomforts, injuries, and illnesses. And they have barriers to seeking care that can include financial barriers, language barriers, having the time to go, understanding the system to access services. And they're seasonal, or they can settle in communities. But even if they're seasonal, they're moving from state to state or country to country. And even if they're settled, they're still in isolated communities. So this causes stress. And on top of that injury, it can affect the psychological health of farm workers. So it's been documented that injured on the job farm workers are 7 times more likely to be depressed. Actually, depression and nervios, or anxiety and stress, were present 5 to 2 times more among injured farm workers. And so earlier we mentioned workplace sexual harassment as an injury that they're exposed to. So this is one of those injuries, and the primary victim are women farm workers. And research has shown that this is the most rapidly growing group in the ag labor. And these workers are placed in seasonal jobs. So they're not hired among permanent or leadership positions. So moving forward, we should continue to take a look at this issue, because this group of workers is growing, and they may be in disempowered positions in the workforce because they're not being hired for permanent or leadership positions. So it's important to look at this issue further and continue to shed light on the topic and raise these voices. Now, in my approach, I recognize that the effectiveness of existing programs is uncertain. A few studies explore the impact or extent of workplace sexual harassment among farm workers. And my aim here is to evaluate workplace sexual harassment among farm workers, to generate hypotheses, and to lift these vulnerable and marginalized workers' voices. And so I'm taking an occupational health emphasis to this study. I'm under the graduate group of epidemiology, but I'm leaning on social epi methods, which means I'm looking at interactions and social behaviors and how that impacts health outcomes. And so I recognize workplace sexual harassment as an occupational hazard here. And I'm using a mixed method sequential exploratory design to approach the topic, influenced by community-based participatory research methods. And because it's shown to have great results among farm workers, and the invitation of other stakeholders. And I'm also inviting stakeholders to participate as community advisory board members, but also other leaders that consult on our efforts. So my mixed method sequential exploratory design consists first of focus groups. Chapter 1 and chapter 2 and chapter 3 are consisting of surveys, cross-sectional surveys conducted, and that focus on experiences and collecting data on myth acceptance. And chapter 4 it works with the data in order to present models. So the focus groups were conducted in the first year, and they influenced and helped lead us into survey work. And lastly, by year 3, we cleaned data and started to work on that to develop models. And so there are 2 novel inclusions in my study, 2 research gaps that I address. The first is that I'm comparing farm workers in United States and Mexico binationally, and this makes sense. It's really relevant because Mexico is the country that most frequently sends farm workers to California and the rest of the U.S. Not only that, Michoacán, Mexico, is the 3rd top location in Mexico that sends farm workers to the United States, specifically California and Illinois. And so this is my team. I couldn't have done this without my partners. We had a team at Davis, which consisted of myself and Dr. McCurdy, and we had a team in Universidad Michoacana de San Nicolás de Hidalgo, with our Mexico PI, Doctora Maria Elena Rivera Heredia, and my partner, Lizette Guadalupe Martinez Servin. The second novel inclusion is the invitation of male farm workers. So across the board in these studies, men are the major perpetrators, but they are 70 to 75% of the workforce. And so we believe that there are certain men in that group who may play other roles like advocates, victims, or bystanders. And so in order to approach the issue knowing all the players and trying to get a handle on all the information we can understand, we invited male farm workers to improve our approach and understanding. And we sampled in 2 locations, like I said, Michoacán, Mexico, and California, United States. In Michoacán, we sampled from Morelia, Buenavista, Tangancícaro, Tarímbaro, and Cheranástico. And in California, we sampled in Yolo County. Now here is a table showing the distribution of the men and women in each location for our surveys and for our focus groups, for a total of 96 men and 135 women. And for chapter 1, I am titling this with a quotation straight from a Mexico male farm worker in our study. He was quoted saying, "These things, they are always going to keep happening." And here I'll discuss workplace sexual harassment focus group findings. Now, the aims of my focus groups were to investigate if attitudes, perspectives, beliefs, and experiences differed for farm workers by country and by gender. And we started with focus groups because it offers an investigation from the participant's perspective. It gives farm workers the space to inform hypotheses, the items available in the survey, and to provide more information behind responses. This really gives them the floor as the experts on the issue, those who bear the burden of the social illness here. And so my methods included 4 focus groups with 5 to 10 participants in each, 2 hours each, and the focus groups were stratified or separated by country and gender. So women and men were separated in each country, United States and Mexico. And analysis, we analyzed with standard methods. Our data consisted of audio recordings and Spanish transcripts, and our population was a purposeful sample in Michoacán and California with adults aged 18 years or older and fluent in Spanish and or Purépecha. And we led our focus groups with our focus group guide. This guide consisted of 5 sections. First, we introduced images. Second, we introduced vignettes or stories of situations that could happen in the workplace. Second, we looked at sexual harassment myths. And third, we looked at the definition and examples, and we asked about their experiences in their place of work. And we ended with the barriers they face to prevention and responding to workplace sexual harassment and the recommendations they had on the topic. And as I said earlier in our analyses, we moved from identifying patterns in the discussions and the conversations. Those we labeled as codes. Those were guided through how we organized our focus group guide. But also there were new patterns that farm workers were providing. And so these were codes labeled as participant-led emerging topics. And so that provided additional information. These codes were then organized into groups, and those groups we called as categories. And then we stitched these categories for themes to tell a story of the observations that we had in our findings. Now, the final focus group findings consisted of 3 themes with 6 categories and 25 codes. For this presentation, I'm going to walk you through our theme 1. And theme 1 was titled Experiences of Workplace Sexual Harassment. And the first category was testimonios, or examples of real life instances that farm workers were providing. So for example, we were hearing a lot of unwanted sexual attention exposure from men and women in the US and women in Mexico. Our second category is contributing factors and effects on bystanders. And so here we're hearing a lot of conversation on how a lack of education can make someone more vulnerable from men and women in US and men in Mexico. And we heard a lot of bystanders when they would hear about the workplace sexual harassment that was happening, they would engage in victim blaming. And this we saw among conversations between men in the US, women in the US, men in Mexico, and women in Mexico. And now when we look at focus group data, we're looking at the conversations that they're having and the quotes that they share. So I have two quotes here as an example for the audience. First, I cite a woman farm worker saying, "One man forced himself, attempted rape on me also. It was a crew leader who was also a transporter. And after he did it to me, I no longer went to work." And here's a second quote from a male farm worker saying, "It's wrong because the young woman could be my sister, daughter, or wife." And now in summary for the focus group findings, we drafted a manuscript and were able to submit that to the Journal of Agro-Medicine. And this paper is published and available for researchers and other academic members in the community that would like to read it. However, we did want to come up with a material that could be used among farm workers, by farm workers, for farm workers. And so we came up with a Cuento, which was a 10-minute story, a popular education method for education purposes and or group conversation, group discussions. This has been reviewed by a few of our community advisory board members and a few of our partners in leaders in the field. And so that is available in print form, script form, in audio, and in video. And we may improve it to a version 2 or a version 3, but for now, it's been deemed useful and shared among our California farm labor contractors for education. We also drafted a policy brief sharing the information for the community and for leaders in government to amend legislation or improve the occupational health and safety of farm workers through that venue. And another thing I want to do is well, we'll get to that later. But for chapter 2, I'm titling this by a direct quote from a U.S. woman farm worker saying, "He said he followed us because we had pretty hips." And here we'll look at cross-sectional survey findings on workplace sexual harassment experiences. Now, the aims of this survey were to evaluate prevalence among farm workers and to see if attitudes, perspectives, beliefs, and experiences differed for farm workers by country, by gender. And we wanted to conduct a survey because it offered an investigation from the researcher's point of reference. And now our work consisted of calculating the sample size, designing the survey, administering the survey, managing the data, and analyzing data. Now in designing our survey, and here we're looking at experiences, this piece of methods was informed by the focus groups, by variable selection in the literature review we had, by items from validated surveys among Spanish speakers or among women farm workers. And it was also, the instrument was also reviewed by our community advisory board, where they gave us input and they gave us new items to include or other items. And we also took the draft and piloted that among farm workers at Clínica Tepati, a nonprofit organization that provides primary care services to farm workers in Northern California. And we moved on to administer the survey after that. So my job consisted of posting flyers, knocking on doors, having face-to-face interactions with farm workers to improve trust, to build rapport, and to recruit and retain farm workers in the study. So after that, we administered the survey, which was 1 hour, one-on-one, private location so that they could feel comfortable, understand the confidentiality agreement, and feel safe disclosing of sensitive information. And so after that, they received their incentives and resources. Now here's a table of our summary demographic characteristics of the farm workers. And I'll point out that most of them were born in Mexico. There were older farm workers in California. Farm workers in California had higher education levels. However, 47% of all farm workers had less than 7 years of education. And there were more married men than women in both United States and Mexico. And 80% had children. So this just paints a picture of the group that we had sampled. And so in looking at the survey section on experiences, I wanted to look at 4 kinds of workplace sexual harassment. So the first was gender discrimination, the second, hostile behavior, the third, unwanted sexual attention, and the fourth, quid pro quo. For this presentation, I will share our gender discrimination findings. And the definition we use is misogynist comments without sexual content. There were 3 items under this dimension, and the first read, someone at your workplace makes comments that insult women. For example, saying women do not make good supervisors or something similar. The second item read, someone in your job makes crude and sexual jokes, stories, or comments that describe women negatively. And the third item asks, someone at your workplace says words to insult women, for example, saying that they are easy. And now we can look at the findings. And there was more gender discrimination in Mexico, but it did occur in the United States as well. So the range of exposure for women was from 39 to 44%. And for men in the United States, they were reporting this kind of exposure around 34 to 42%. And women in Mexico experienced gender discrimination, and they were reporting this from 43 to 57%. And men as well were reporting exposure to these kinds of items from 50 to 68%. And we can see a significant gender difference among men and women in Mexico for item 2, where they're hearing jokes or stories that describe women negatively. And we can see here that men in Mexico were exposed to this more than women. And so we also wanted to know with what frequency these exposures occur. And so we asked on a scale from 1 to 5, how frequently are they experiencing this? So the most frequent level was always, which is 1 to 2 times a week. Very frequently was 1 to 2 times a month. Frequently was 4 to 6 times a year. Sometimes was 1 to 3 times a year, and never was 0. And so we see here in our gender discrimination findings that women and men farm workers were exposed to gender discrimination on a weekly basis and on an annual basis. It's also important to share that the proportion of farm workers receiving 2 or more of the workplace sexual harassment types were 53% of men and 57% of women in California, and 80% of men and 67% of men in Michoacán. And all farm workers identified perpetrators at the leadership and co-worker level. And so we've drafted a manuscript for chapter 2 with experiences, and we've submitted that for review in the Journal of Agricultural Safety and Health, and they've accepted our manuscript. So right now we're just going back and forth about with reviewers on comments, and we'll have that ready for academic readers. But we've also at this point now started drafting our policy brief, and that's being reviewed by my team. Next, it will start to get reviewed by our community advisory board and our partners. So that's where our dissemination efforts are at this point for chapter 2. For chapter 3, this is titled with a quote from a Mexico woman farm worker, where she says, "She must have done something to provoke him." And here we'll look at cross-sectional survey findings on workplace sexual harassment myth acceptance. And again, these methods were the same for chapter 2 survey methods. We calculated our sample size, designed our survey, administered it, managed the data, and conducted data analysis. And so for myth acceptance, it was this section was informed by the same input as before: focus group findings, variable selection from the literature review, from items from validated surveys, and it was reviewed and we received input from our community advisory board, and we also piloted the draft among farm workers at Clínica Tepati. And for myth acceptance, I wanted to look at 4 major kinds. The first was fabrication exaggeration. The second was ulterior motives. The third was natural heterosexuality. And the fourth was women's responsibility. For this presentation, I'll walk you through our results of the natural heterosexuality, defined as belief that sexual harassment is simply romantic behavior that women enjoy. Now we had 4 items, and the first item asked for an agreement or acceptance of these beliefs. And the first read, the majority of women feel flattered when men at work notice them sexually. And the second read, deep down, most women enjoy it when men at work make sexual advances towards them. And the third read, it is inevitable that men flirt with women sexually in the workplace. And the fourth read, women shouldn't be so quick to consider it offensive when a man makes a sexual advance towards them at work. Now, in these results, we can see that, again, women and men in Mexico had higher percentage of believing myths than in the United States, but it still did occur in the United States. So acceptance among women ranged from 10 to 34%. Acceptance among men ranged from 13 to 29%, and acceptance among women in Mexico ranged from 32 to 53%, and acceptance among men in Mexico ranged from 33 to 80%. And we did not find any statistical differences between genders in each country. So men and women believed and accepted sexual harassment myths similarly within each country. It's also important for me to share that the proportion of farm workers who accepted 2 or more myths were 63% of men, 81% of women in California, and 100% of men, and 97% of women in Michoacán. And so for chapter 3, we have drafted a manuscript of our survey myth acceptance findings. This is at its 3rd version, I believe. And so we will submit that for publication this summer. And we're also working on a brief. And we're going to work closely with our partners to create a popular education materials in dissemination efforts. My final chapter it talks about workplace sexual harassment models. And this is using the data to build mathematical models looking at the factors relationship with the outcome. And for here, for this section, our aim was to investigate associations between the outcome of workplace sexual harassment and suspected demographic and organizational factors. And we did this because models help us understand what kind of associations these factors have with the outcome. For example, they can provide information on the association's direction and magnitude. So for example, this could be a factor that's protective or that increases the risk. And it could be something that has a weak relationship or a strong relationship. And so in order to build these models, I used recommended guidelines learned in my coursework. So this consisted of a 3-stage strategy of specifying the variables, assessing interaction, and assessing confounding. And before moving on, I wanted to look at the correlations between these factors and the outcomes. So I ran a non-parametric experiment correlation analysis. After that, I moved on to simple logistic regression to isolate each factor and see how it was associated with outcomes. And after that, I moved on to adding more factors to see how the group of factors associated with the outcome. And my final model was based on forward selection with the inclusion of theoretically important factors. And in looking at our models, I wanted to build 4, but we didn't have enough information to build a model for quid pro quo. So we ended up building 3 models with 3 outcomes. And the first was gender discrimination, the second hostile behavior, and the third is unwanted sexual harassment. The factors that we studied included country, gender, civil status, if they're married or not, age, family, working in the crew or not, education level, primary language, country of birthplace, workplace sexual harassment myth acceptance, pay level, and if there was a reporting officer present in the workplace or not. And so I'll show you our results for gender discrimination. And interestingly, for all outcomes, there were a few variables that were higher among victims. So among victims, we saw that generally they were more women, they were more farm workers in Mexico, they were married, more farm workers who worked among family, farm workers receiving low wages, and farm workers in disagreement with myths. And this was for just descriptive statistics. Now moving on to correlation analysis, we focus on gender discrimination, and we could see that age and language were significantly associated, such that younger aged farm workers were more likely to, or were receiving more gender discrimination. And with language, the farther away you got from English, the more gender discrimination you face. So for example, from English to Spanish to other to Purépecha language, we saw that the farther you got on that language spectrum, the more gender discrimination you were receiving. In simple logistic regression, we were able to isolate age as a significantly associated factor with gender discrimination, showing that the younger you are, the more likely you are to be exposed to gender discrimination. And our final model with forward selection included age and language. And in my previous assessment, language was a confounder, so I knew that this was going to be included in the model. But I also added country and gender because these are theoretically important variables, and we selected for gender and country. And as you can see in the model, only one factor was significantly, has a significant p-value. But I believe that this might be influenced by our small sample size, and I think in future studies, when we include a larger sample size, we'll be able to get more information out of these, out of logistic regression. So in summary, we looked at my mixed methods sequential exploratory design. I began with focus groups, which led me to surveys on experiences and myth acceptance, and that data was used to build models to isolate factors of importance. And so for chapter 1, the strengths include that it was just transcribed by hand. We added a human dimension to impersonal data, and it allowed us to deepen the understanding and explanation of the data. But there were limitations. For example, because it is focus groups, participants may have self-censored themselves in discussions and may have engaged in group thinking. Versus in qualitative interviews, when it's one-on-one, they may have felt more freedom to share more of their thoughts and views. But focus groups do provide useful material in their quotes and citations for public relations, publications, and presentations. For chapter 2 survey, in chapter 2 and 3 in our surveys, this was great because it provided descriptive analyses and helped us generate more hypotheses. And because it was cross-sectional, I was able to look at multiple outcomes and exposures. But the limitations do include that I'm not able to look at incidence, which is the first exposure for each person. But another limitation is that participants self-selected themselves in the study. So that might bias our results, as well as they have to remember things that happened to them. So this could also present some recall bias. But again, it has another great impact because it provides information on prevalence, which is important for public health in assessing the burden and in planning and allocating health resources. For chapter 4, our strengths include that I'm able to quantify factors previously considered as anecdotal evidence. So I'm able to give mathematical, statistical evidence behind what was believed to be influential factors. And my limitations include that I wasn't able to get a larger sample size, so that could have impacted my evaluation of effect modification, confounding, and subgroup effects. But I also had a limited geographic scope, so my findings may not be generalizable to the larger population. But again, it can lead to have a great impact and aid public health dissemination efforts with information on an association's direction and magnitude. So in closing, I want to highlight some of the recommendations that farmworkers had. For example, their first out of 4 recommendations included rapid training for new hires. We heard them say that the male farm workers who come from Mexico may hold beliefs and norms of thinking that can increase the likelihood of perpetrating workplace sexual harassment, such as like gazing at women's bodies or catcalling. And so also we heard that women coming from Mexico may believe that this is part of the job. And that is not true when working in the United States. And so farm workers recommended rapid training for new hires to prevent this. Secondly, farm workers wanted to see leadership set a good example with requesting that everyone respect each other and creating a safe working environment for everyone and modeling the good behaviors that is required to prevent workplace sexual harassment. And then farm workers also recommended that leadership enforce consequences. In our findings and previous findings, we've seen that perpetrators they're not laid off, they're not fired, they don't face consequences, and sometimes they're just moved to another crew, or sometimes they're moved to another farm, or they're laid off and they find work at another farm. So that offers them the opportunity to harass again. And farm workers have noticed this, and they recommend that consequences be swift and that leadership take action. Lastly, farm workers recommended alternate reporting methods. So they recognize that sometimes the victim can be abused by leadership. It could be a crew leader or a supervisor. And so this crew leader and supervisor is in the way to seeking help. And so farm workers have recommended that companies provide other kinds of ways to report so that victims can get so that victims can have their cases heard. So in summary, we looked at workplace sexual harassment among men and women farm workers in my Michoacán and California sample. And my mixed method sequential exploratory design consisted of farm focus groups that led to surveys and helped me develop models. And the purpose of the study is to support the ag community, educators, researchers, and organizations' efforts to improve the prevention of and response to workplace sexual harassment among farm workers. So thank you for your time. And I'd like to thank my colleagues in Mexico and PEMSA, UC Berkeley's Program of Investigation in Migration and Health, and my NIOSH grant, and like guidance and funding and support from the Western Center for Ag Health and Safety. The numerous partners on this project who are very patient with me and get back to me. I really appreciate them. And my team, Dr. McCurdy, Doctora Maria Elena Rivera Heredia, and Lizette Guadalupe Martinez Servin, and my teachers who have helped me along this on this journey as well, Dr. Bang, Dr. Cassidy, Dr. Kanlan, Dr. Patala, Dr. Harch, and Dr. Harvey, and my classmates who helped me through the project, and lastly, the farm workers for being courageous enough to work with me and allowing me to have this platform for their voices. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kimberly. That was just a really wonderful presentation and synthesis of many years of hard work. So thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. And I look forward to being able to disseminate your research findings through the Ag Center in multiple ways. So for anyone who has any questions, we do have a few minutes. Please enter your question into the chat box and I will pose them to Kimberly. So first, a clarifying question. For the gender discrimination survey results, do the percentages for men mean that they were the subject of gender discrimination themselves, or they experienced seeing it happen towards women?
So this was not gender discrimination towards men themselves. This was them seeing gender discrimination identified as, women being victims, women receiving misogynistic comments.
Great, thank you for clarifying. Okay, and I had a question because I really appreciated seeing that rapid training was one of the requests and recommendations coming from farm workers. I think what I thought was really interesting was that the recommendations included sort of policy, follow-up, but also training. It was sort of multifaceted recommendations. Did the farm workers give any insight into the type of training or the approach of training that they think would be most effective in practice in the workplace?
Yeah, so we found differences in literacy between farm workers in Mexico and the United States. So more were able to read and write in the United States, but still about close to half of them had lower education levels. So they were really pushing for discussions, radionovelas, so audio of stories. So the Cuento worked really well. It was 10 minutes, it's straight to the point. It gave examples, it gave why it's illegal, it gave how it can have an impact. And I'd also like to make another point that just because gender harassment was measured with women being receiving the hostile language, that still impacted the men. The men were saying, you know, this made me anxious, this made me uncomfortable. It resulted in poor group morale, and so it hurt me as well. And I have aunts and daughters and sisters in the job, and as I see this, I see them as victims. So it had an impact on them as well. But going back to your question, yeah, they wanted popular education methods. So that's what we're going to try to do moving forward. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. So given the extent of myth acceptance in your sample, and you gave some examples, especially as people moved from Mexico to California, is it possible that your incidence of sexual harassment was lower than expected because many individuals may not have recognized the behavior or actions they were seeing as sexual harassment?
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question. So that calls to how we measure workplace sexual harassment. And there's two kinds of ways you can go about it. You can do direct inquiry based, where you simply ask the person, have you experienced workplace sexual harassment? And then that's where all of their beliefs and their understandings come in to play as they respond. The second method is behavior based workplace sexual harassment, where you're providing an example, an objective example of a behavior, and if it occurs or not. So here you're controlling for a person's beliefs or backgrounds, and you're getting a response that's more reliable. And not only that, those same items can be used in Illinois, in Tamaulipas, in New York, in Michoacán, and you'll still receive the same feedback. So it's because the behavior is it's not asking for your opinion or your belief or whether or not you understand if you were victimized. It's asking for a behavior that is sexual harassment. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I want to acknowledge that we have many questions coming in and may not get to all of them. There's also just a lot of praise, Kimberly, for your presentation. So I want to acknowledge that. And we will hopefully be able to follow up with some questions after this seminar. And then again, as a reminder, the seminar will be available on YouTube tomorrow. Okay, so a question about, did you collect any data about participants' mental health, especially that of the victims of sexual harassment?
Well, so I in our focus groups, we were able to hear testimonials of how this was affecting their health and resulting in suicidal ideation, resulting in anxiety, poor work or group morale. But in our survey, we had to make some tough decisions. We couldn't go beyond the hour because we had to also respect the farm workers' time, and we had to understand that what they could, the time that they could give us was limited. But that is something that we wish we would have done. So documenting depression, PTSD, documenting suicidal ideation in the measured form in a survey, that is something that we didn't do. But moving forward, that's a direction of great interest to me in the future. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, there's another question about experiences potentially by gay farm workers and whether or not they experienced a different or unique type of harassment, and whether or not your data, you mentioned your sample size was maybe more modest than might show some of the presence of different kinds of experiences. Did you have any responses by gay farm workers about their experience with harassment?
This was a question that we brought up for our community advisory boards in Mexico and in the United States, and this was something that occurred in the field. And in our focus groups, we designed our stories, our situations to include multi-gender perpetrator victim combinations, and so but we in the focus groups we had different responses. So in Mexico, this was a topic that none of the farm workers wanted to talk about. None of them wanted to address. It was complete silence that we were receiving on their end. But in the United States, we had some male input and a lot of women farm worker input. So in the survey, the way that we approached this was to measure different combinations of gender, perpetrator, victim, sexual harassment, and we have that data. But we didn't seek to ask more questions because our aim was to look at the experiences of men and women farm workers, and we believe that we need more information to address appropriately this question of LGBTQ plus farm workers. And so that's another area of great interest to me moving forward. It's a lot of work, but we aim to address it, having known more parameters than what we do now.
That's fabulous. Yeah, there are many research questions that still exist. A last sort of one that I think might be something I'd be curious if you're going to be exploring after you complete your PhD, is that, in California, there are now training requirements on sexual harassment prevention, both for supervisors and for employees. I'm not sure if that's the case in Mexico. I don't know that it's the case in other states in California. Have you considered doing a cross, sort of a study looking at the different experiences in different locations based on the policies that exist?
Yeah, so right now the policies that are being pushed forward is predominantly for farm labor contractors, but there's other kinds of employers, direct hires, and other H-2A recruited farm workers. So even within evaluating, the kind of farm, the kind of hiring has to be taken into account. And in Mexico, you're right. There's not a lot of regulation on the topic. It's not as enforced as is in the United States. But moving forward, I am working with farm labor contractors, and they have received some of them have received my Cuento, and I'm working closely with them to hear the updates and their struggles. And in order to address the needs of employers and the needs of in the field training, that would require us to have another study looking at the employer's perspective. So number one, I want to evaluate the Cuento to see if it's working or not. Number two, I also want to work with employers' leadership to see what their barriers are, what their challenges are, and if they have any recommendations moving forward, because they too are experts in this area. They're seeing it, they're responding to it, and in our findings, there were examples of some great leadership. Moving forward with them would be a great part of continuation of the work.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kimberly. I think that we did not get to all the questions, but we will share them with you afterwards. And we are so thankful for your presentation and the great work you're doing. It's meaningful and really valuable. So thank you. And everyone, thank you for joining us today. Please register for next month's seminar. I believe it's on May 3rd, the first Monday of the month at 4 p.m. And we will have Dr. Phil Martin speaking about ag labor in California. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon. Bye.